Fuck. Oh. Hello. Didn't see you there. Hello. My name is Diego, and you're in my room. And we're gonna talk about music because this is something I've kind of been like secretly in my mind hoping to do for a very long time, but I've never had the time to do it. But now that we're in quarantine and the world's gone crazy, I figured why not just make a video, because I got nothing fucking better to do in my life. Today we're going to talk about Radiohead. Now, who is Radiohead? Well, they're actually one of the most famous bands ever. I don't really know why. They're kind of just a rock band. But really, though, Radiohead made some very incredible records in their time, and I don't think they're one of the most experimental bands in the world, as some people claim, but I think in their own sound they've really ventured into some really interesting things, and I would love to talk about them here today, but in a kind of worst to best format, where I talk about what I think is their worst album to what I think is their best. So without further ado, let's start with number 9. I put The King of Limbs at dead last. The King of Limbs was Radiohead's 8th album, released in 2011, and it's just so boring. The experiments Radiohead go for on this album just don't really pan out, in my opinion, and I just don't really get why, because this is their 8th album. At this point in their career, they've been at it for almost 20 years, and they have done amazingly successful IDM experiments in the past. So I just don't know what the problem here was. It kind of sucks because the teaser song for this album, Lotus Flower, is actually a pretty beautifully desolate track. It has Tom York's best vocal melodies on this record, and it has some pretty interesting percussive ideas too. I wouldn't say it's one of my favorite Radiohead songs ever, but it is definitely one of the songs I come back to the most. The tracks like the intro and Feral and Little by Little do almost nothing for me. Feral especially just has this really overblown, buzzy bass thing. It's not good. Codex at least has piano melodies, but they don't sound very good. I think my biggest problem with this album, and why it's at the very bottom, is that this is just a collection of boring, stale, unimaginative, lifeless experiments that just should have been left on a B-sides collection and not released on a studio album. Now, the debut album is usually considered by Radiohead fans their absolute worst. While it's not hard to see why, I don't know that I necessarily agree. To me, this is just the humble beginnings of a band trying to figure out their sound. I will say, I can see in a sense why people would rank this the worst. I mean, Tom York's vocals here try to do this kind of harsher, grungier thing that just doesn't really work for him. I guess it's just because I listened to OK Computer and all the really celebrated albums before I listened to Pablo Honey, and it's just not something I'm used to from Tom, but it just doesn't really work for me. Nothing really stands out on the songwriting end of things. The hooks aren't very memorable, especially when you compare them to subsequent releases. And my god, the second half of this freaking album just drags on. I don't think there's one memorable song on here, except maybe the closer. The closer's actually pretty good. It's a pretty hard-hitting track with driving drums and a wailing effects-soaked guitar solo at the end. It's pretty awesome, actually, and a very good closer to this mediocre album. But as far as the sound of a 90s alt-rock record goes, this is a pretty respectable release. It's kind of shoegazy at points, and I think that's where the album really shines for me. Tracks like You and Stop Whispering, I had to read the name, those tracks really set a beautiful atmosphere. Thinking About You is a pretty good acoustic ballad, and I guess I can't talk about this album without talking about Creep. Everyone knows that Creep is Radiohead's biggest single ever, and Creep is also the song that's ridiculed by Radiohead fans for being normie music for normies. Now, I'm not saying that's not a fair statement. I mean, this track blew up, and honestly, it's not that great. I think the bulk of this song is pretty bland and boring, but I think Thom Yorke's vocal performance near the bridge of this track is actually pretty fantastic. I wouldn't totally dismiss the track, and I wouldn't totally dismiss the album either. Most people put Pablo Honey and The King of Limbs at the bottom of their lists, pretty invariably, but I think the biggest reason this album ranks slightly higher than The King of Limbs is that it at least has character and like the energy of like a new band. Like I said before, this album is the humble beginnings of a band who had infinite potential. More importantly for this ranking, it's just a very respectable 90s alt-rock record. I will say though, I know everyone loves this track from this album for some reason, but Anyone Can Play Guitar is pretty laughably bad. I think Hail to the Thief is pretty overrated. Hail to the Thief was Radiohead's sixth album. It was released in 2003. It kind of saw the band return to form a little bit after the huge departure from their sound that was Kid A and then AMNESIAC, but it still maintained some of those experiments. This is Radiohead's longest album at 57 minutes, and I gotta say, it doesn't do a whole lot for me. I think if the album had the consistency, energy, and the beauty of the first three tracks, this would be a much better listen. But after Sail to the Moon, this album I think falls pretty flat on its face. I would say this is Radiohead's most inconsistent release. There's just a lot of very underwhelming moments on this record that take up way too much real estate. I think Scatterbrain is a pretty boring tune with these like twinkly guitars that don't really do a whole lot for me. Backdrifts is just this weird ambient pop piece. The Gloaming is... oh my god. The Gloaming is... I promise, guys, that's not a monkey, that's my dog. Oh my god, leave her alone. Luna. More dog. Oh my god! Ugh. The Gloaming is just... oh my god, dog. The Gloaming is just boring. Go to Sleep sounds like a B-side from the Bends. And I cannot stand the closer on here, A Wolf at the Door, which is so unfortunate because the chorus here is actually quite beautiful. Beautiful, beautiful, beautiful. But the verses on here, man, Thom Yorke's almost like spoken word vocals here are just not doing it for me. There are great moments on this record though. I like There quite a bit. Myxomatosis is a pretty great alt-rock track with this really energetic, buzzy riff that plays throughout. 2 + 2 = 5 is a fantastic opener. Maybe the highlight of the whole album. It just has such an amazing, grand presentation. And like I said, the 2 tracks that follow it are pretty good too. Sit Down, Stand Up is a pretty haunting, lullaby-esque tune, and Sail to the Moon has some pretty gorgeous progressions too. But I think that's the problem, is that the first song is kind of the best one. I just don't think there's enough on this album to really hold my interest for that long. And I honestly forget this album even exists sometimes.
Nothing to fear, nothing to
die. AMNESIAC was Radiohead's 5th album, released in 2001, and it is by far their most divisive album ever. There is a clear divide between people who love the very hypnotizing electronic experiments on this album and the other side of people who just think this is a collection of Kid A afterbirths. I kind of find myself at a crossroads with this album. It kind of reminds me of The King of Limbs a bit in the sense that it is very repetitive and hypnotic. But the difference here, I think, is that some of the tracks have some really interesting sounds going on. I don't have any problem with repetition in music itself. Some of my favorite records feature tracks where the band is playing one chord for like 15 minutes. But it's awesome. But it's the way the repetition carries the music. While The King of Limbs is just bland and repetitive, AMNESIAC is repetitive and sometimes boring, but sometimes has some pretty beautiful moments that just linger on forever. I think the chord progression in Pyramid Song is just too beautiful to not have that playing for 4 minutes in a track. I think Knives Out is also a fantastic tune with great guitar work, and I actually like Polk Pole Revolving Doors. It's blisteringly mechanical, it's creepy, it's percussive, it's honestly kind of groovy at points. And the repetition serves all those musical ideas. But there are a lot of tracks on here that are pretty devoid of interest. I think the opener on here is pretty boring. Also, Hunting Bears is just kind of a pointless guitar interlude. And Morning Bell is just an inferior and blatantly unfinished version of a song we've heard before. You and Whose Army has some interesting vocal harmonies going on, but I don't really like Tom's leads on this track. I think there are a lot of more interesting ideas on here than on The King of Limbs for sure, but I don't think it really holds up. And I can definitely see where fans are coming from when they're calling this a glorified B-sides collection.
They protect me, listen to me.
You know, I've watched a lot of Radioheads, going crazy. I've watched a lot of videos that rank Radiohead's albums, and it blows my mind every time how little credit this album gets. And usually it's because I guess the bands have a sort of similar alt-rock sound to Pablo Honey, but the truth is this sounds nothing like Pablo Honey, at least for me. I think it sounds worlds apart from Pablo Honey, right from the opener. This album has far better production, songwriting, melodies, everything. I think High and Dry and Fake Plastic Trees are still, even to this day, even 6 albums after, still 2 of Radiohead's most beautiful songs they've ever written. Street Spirit Fade Out is a chilling closer, and even some of the more alt-rock tracks like Just and Nice Dream and My Iron Lung and the opener Planet Telex are killer tracks with fantastic writing. Sure, it's not quite as creative and expansive as what the band would be making down the road, which I will talk about in a minute, and there's some duds on here too. The title track, Bones, and Black Star are all pretty bland alt-rock tracks, but this record is far from a sophomore slump. Even these tracks, being my least favorite tracks, are light years ahead of anything on Pablo Honey in terms of songwriting, melodies, and performances too. Radiohead are sounding so much less like their contemporaries on this album, and while they still hadn't completely revolutionized their sound, I think that this album is just a sign that if a band can make a set of tracks that are this enjoyable and this diverse and this well performed in their second album, you know they're going to be something special. Okay, we're in the top half of the list from here on out, and given the albums that I haven't mentioned yet, I imagine that this scenario was pretty predictable, but you might not be expecting what's coming next. And speaking of the bands, the songwriting abilities, the melodic abilities, and the performance capabilities that the bands showed were further sharpened on I know, look. Please put your pitchforks down. Please don't send a bomb to my house. I know this is a nuclear take, especially since Rate Your Music members have voted this album the #1 best album of all time, which, I think that's horseshit. But anyways, OK Computer was Radiohead's 3rd album released in 1997. This album is a lot of things to me. This was actually the first Radiohead album I ever listened to. It was my first introduction to Radiohead in general, in like middle school or freshman year of high school or something like that. It was an album I used to listen to on repeat, and I actually didn't even listen to very many other Radiohead albums while I was listening to OK Computer because I was just loving this album so much it would hinder the time I had to listen to this album. I really loved this album growing up, so I guess it has kind of a special connection for me, yet it's at my fourth spot. And I think my reasoning for this is partially, and only partially, having to do with the fact that the band is simply improving upon the songwriting, sound, and style of their wonderful and criminally underrated sophomore album. But remember, this is also a reason that this album ranks so highly. I mean, people don't love this album for nothing. This is a diverse, well-written, consistent set of tracks. No Surprises is an obvious highlight, with the lullaby-esque xylophone passages that plays throughout the track, and Tom York's melodies effectively hiding the dark lyricism that's provided. The song is dark. Subterranean Homesick Alien has some of the absolute best guitar work that Radiohead has shown to this day. Lucky has Tom York at vocally his most passionate. The Tourist is a gentle and gorgeous closer for this record, one of my favorites. And Exit Music, man, what a powerful build to that euphoric climax at the end. Honestly, probably one of my favorite Radiohead songs ever. My dog's looking at me because I'm talking to myself. Despite all that, there are some tracks I think don't really fit the feel of this album. Electioneering is a very hard-hitting track, and I respect it for being different from a lot of the track list. I guess I'm just not that crazy about the tune, and it kind of takes me out of that experience, I guess. Karma Police is probably my least favorite on this album. I don't think it's at all a terrible track. I just think it's a little overhyped, and I'm not too crazy about the vocal melodies. While Fitter Happier is undoubtedly a very interesting transitional track with some narrations on what you should be happy about in life, I guess the whole robotic vocal thing just didn't really click with me. Look, I don't want to shit talk this album, because really it's an amazing album, and it's not hard to see why many people put this album at the top of their list, and many people do, for fantastic reasons. It's just not the case for me, though.
This goes beyond me, beyond you.
A Moon-Shaped Pool. A Moon-Shaped Pool is the band's latest effort, released in 2016, and it is yet another reinvention of the band. This album takes a more chamber pop direction, and it is sad. This album is freaking sad. Not just in its context, but its sound, too. This album was made around the time that Tom York was splitting up with his partner of 23 years, Rachel Owen. The heartbreak on this music is palpable. The almost ambient track, Daydreaming, is a perfect example of this, with this really somber but lush, muted piano lines that play throughout most of the track. And even the livelier second half with the strings is just chock full of sorrow. Truly one of Radiohead's most beautiful songs on what I think is one of Radiohead's most beautiful albums. I think this album finally accomplishes what albums like AMNESIAC and The King of Limbs just failed to do better. Many of the tracks on here are very atmospheric and hypnotic, and I have used that word so many times now. However, I think it totally works on this album. Like I said, this album's sad, and these somber and hopeless feelings are really given a chance to shine and to really be expressed on this album, especially through the instrumental choices. The lyrics on this album are very bleak too, very minimal. For example, the heartbreaking closer, True Love Waits, has just 3 or 4 words per line in every verse. But even with so few words, the heartbreak and the way Tom longs for the return of this romantic partner is just so full of emotion. Another thing I want to say, and another reason why this album is in this spot instead of OK Computer. I've already said that OK Computer is mainly a continuation and further development on the unique alt-rock sound that they established on the Bends. That is established. But this album and the next 2 albums I'm going to talk about show the band going in a totally new direction and succeeding massively. This is apparent almost immediately in the opening track, Burn the Witch, starting with these heavy, sharp string staccatos. Everything on this track is incredible. The string arrangements, the vocal melodies, and the performances. The track, The Numbers, has these beautiful piano parts that flurry throughout the track. And it also has a great build to this very triumphant string arrangement. So cool, you gotta listen to it. Full Stop is quite the change of pace with these jarring and wailing guitar arpeggiations that are kind of creepy at points. Glass Eyes has these string chords that crescendo from almost nothing. Tinker, Tailor, Soldier, Sailor, Rich Man, Poor Man, Beggar Man? Yep, that's the name of the song. That song has this really melodic string section where all the groupings of the string instruments have melodic and accompanimental roles, sort of like a string symphony. And True Love Waits is very bare bones in comparison with the rest of the track list. With a few low-key but glistening piano tracks under one of Thom Yorke's most emotional performances ever, there's clearly a lot to love about this album. But I think the monotony of the project, while that is something that I do think serves the album itself, I think it hinders it from beating these last two contenders, which leads me to... In Rainbows is Radiohead's 7th album, released in 2007. I see Hail to the Thief as a kind of attempt to try and combine all the ideas they've worked with in the past, but I see this album as the album that gloriously succeeded in doing that, but in the process completely reinventing what that would mean. Not only is this a record that combines all of the ideas that they've done previously, but it's also combining all the ideas that they would work with extensively later on A Moon-Shaped Pool. This album is 10 tracks, a very tight 43 minutes, great songs, and no filler. I would say this is probably their most well-rounded album. The first two tracks are very hard-hitting. The opener 15 Step is a pummeling, energetic track with this fantastic electronic percussion and hand claps, and incredible guitar work, a sick bass line, and a vocal performance that could rival many off of OK Computer. I'm gonna go on record and say this is probably my favorite opening of any Radiohead album. Like I said, the second track is also very hard-hitting, and it's quite a highlight for me. This track is called Body Snatchers. It's another high-energy track with a hard-hitting fuzzy guitar riff that plays throughout, and more of Thom Yorke's best vocal work. Nude is a much-needed come-down track, and a beautiful one too. These beautiful string passages are built as the song progresses towards the end, and it again features one of Thom Yorke's best vocal performances. Weird Fishes / Arpeggi has some of the best drumming that Radiohead has ever shown, and it's also led by these beautiful guitar arpeggios that kind of glide seamlessly through the track. It's just so great. All I Need sticks out in the track list for me, partially because of this kind of fuzzy electronic bass line that plays throughout the track, but also the climactic ending with the hard-hitting piano and the drums and the droning strings, and again, an amazing vocal performance from Thom Yorke. Faust Arp is a fantastically beautiful string-kissed acoustic track. Reckoner, this is a real highlight for me. This track has some of Thom Yorke's most beautiful vocal melodies I've ever heard on any Radiohead song ever. And the string arrangements and the vocal harmonies towards the end just add so much color to this track. Real standout for me. House of Cards is probably the most straightforward tune on the record, but even that track has great melodies and a pretty sweet chord progression. Jigsaw Falling Into Place is another vocal highlight for me from Thom, and probably some of the best guitar work I've ever heard on any radio song, period. This song also has a great build to the climax of this track. Just so many explosive moments on this album, and I am so here for it. Videotape is another example of Radiohead's ability to skillfully bookend an album. If Radiohead was only good at one thing, which they're not, but if they were only good at one thing, it would definitely be album closers. Anyway, this final track is a piano-driven ballad that's heightened by these kind of intercepting drum crescendos that kind of play throughout the track. This record is amazing. In fact, I don't think there's a single dud on here. In fact, I don't think there's even half a dud on here. This album is 43 minutes of exciting, well-written, well-performed, well-paced songs that are a near-perfect combination of everything the band has done and will do in the future. But even with all the nice things I could say about this album, I think there is one more album that deserves this #1 spot more than any other. Yes, when we're talking about what I think is the best album experience, as well as the closest the band came to think I have to give the crown to Kid A, the band's fourth album released in 2000. It's probably a popular pick, but I don't think it's hard to see why. But to be honest, it's actually pretty tough for me to decide between Kid A and In Rainbows for this number one spot. But I think I can make a pretty good case as to why I put this at number one. Picture this. It's 97. You're Radiohead. OK Computer just came out as a huge success. It reaches number one on the UK charts. It peaks at number 21 at the US charts. But hey, that's the highest you've ever seen in your life. You get nominated for Album of the Year at the Grammys, and you win a Best Alternative Album at the Grammys. Your band is on top of the world. So what does Radiohead do on their next album instead of following this alt-rock path that they've been going on since the beginning? They take an enormous leap of faith and completely reinvent their entire sound and put out what I think is their best work yet. There are a lot of things I could say about this album. I think this is Radiohead's most expansive album. The soundscapes that Radiohead create on this thing are vast, icy fields. I don't really know how to describe it, but this album sounds the way the album looks. The cover, well, I mean, I don't know, they're not really fields, they're more like mountains. Whatever, you get the point. This is Radiohead's most ambitious album. Not only is this a crazy cohesive art rock experimentation that delves into IDM and experimental big band and 20th century classical music and ambient music, among other things, but like I said, this is a complete 180 departure from everything they had done before. And everything in its right place immediately puts you in that anxious atmosphere. This track has these very heavy keyboard chords that kind of envelop the whole track. Thom Yorke's vocals are glitched out as hell. It is creepy, and it is so claustrophobic too. I've already said that 15 Step was my favorite Radiohead opener as a standalone track, but I think this opener was necessary for this album. It really sets up this kind of frigid, lonely atmosphere. The national anthem has a very driving bass line and is honestly one of the easier tracks to listen to on this album, and that's saying something, because there's still a crazy trumpet freak out at the end and these dense, disjointed brass chords that just totally pervade your brain and your ear canals. Oh, crazy. Optimistic is also the only song that resembles a standard rock tune, but I love the guitar playing, the chorus is a goddamn earworm, and Tom's vocal performances are like In Rainbows levels of passion. The track that immediately follows it, In Limbo, by contrast has these really weird fleeting guitar arpeggios, and this track also has an absolute whirlwind of sound at the end. A lot of people see Tree Fingers as this kind of pointlessly long, boring interlude, but I just see it as a pretty beautiful piece of ambient music. Sure, I guess it's a transitional track, but it's a beautiful one. Going back in the track list, the title track has Thom Yorke kind of doing these almost robotic vocals over this kind of lullaby-esque keyboards. It's quite an unsettling moment. Then there's Idiotheque, one of the more famous tracks on the album, and it's a phenomenal piece of IDM with gorgeous chorus melody and some really driving drum machines. The track that follows it seamlessly is Morning Bell, and I much, much, much prefer this version to the AMNESIAC version. The kind of anxious percussion is way more interesting, and the kind of swirling keys that explode in the middle of the track, glorious moment. And I cannot leave this video without talking about my two favorite Radiohead songs ever, and they just both happen to be on the same album. The first of these tracks is How to Disappear Completely, the fourth track. There's just such a genuine beauty to this song. The song is a gentle, acoustic guitar-led ballad with Thom Yorke singing these lyrics very hopelessly. That there, that's not me. I go where I please. I walk through walls. I float down the Liffey. I'm not here. This isn't happening. You can completely sense the loss of self and the anxiety that Thom Yorke feels, probably from the fame of the last album. It all just kind of comes out on this track. But it's not just an acoustic ballad. There's so many subtle instrumental layers that give so much color to this track. Oh, it's so good. From the reverb guitar refrain that pops up every so often, and the very emotionally potent string section that beautifully accompanies Thom Yorke's vocal melodies, and even just the little simplies that kind of flurry their way through a few lines of the song. Just adds so much musical depth to the track. And the final little touch that makes this track really stand out for me is this kind of floating, ominous dissonance in the strings at the very beginning of the track. This dissonance hovers very subtly below the tune, which for me adds this underlying anxiety to supplement the lyrics. Beautiful track. Amazing track. Second of these tracks is the closing track, motion picture soundtrack. The track a lot. I think this closer musically is perfect. The organ that kind of booms its way through the entire track is gorgeous. And I love that you can even hear the clicking of the pedals or the keys or whatever. And I don't think Tom's voice here is too intrusive. In fact, I think he blends very well with the sound of the organ, almost as if the organ was an extension of Tom, or if Tom was an extension of the organ. Who knows? And just when you thought it couldn't get better, the second half of this track features these euphoric, gorgeous, glistening harp runs. And near the end of this track, when Tom sings, "I will see you in the next life," is probably one of the most beautifully drawn out harmonic resolutions I've ever heard on any radio song ever. Probably one of the most beautiful harmonic progressions of any song ever. That's all I'll say about the ending. Please listen to these songs, and please listen to this album. Now, while Kid A is clearly my favorite Radiohead album, this record is not for everyone. These tracks are very dense, kind of cerebral, very lonely, nowhere near as immediate as an In Rainbows or an OK Computer, and certainly not the Bends. Definitely not as depressing as a moon-shaped pool, but you get the idea. Honestly, not entirely sure if this album would still be my number one if those two tracks didn't exist. But what I will say in my defense is that Kid A feels more like a complete and expansive experience than any other album Radiohead has done. Many of the other albums are this Many of the other albums on this list are a great set of diverse tracks with amazing songwriting, but this album feels more like I'm going on a journey to sound itself, probably more than any album Radiohead has done before and after. And I think that's why this is my pick for number one. Those are my thoughts on this album. Those are my thoughts on these albums. I love this album. I'm gonna keep loving this album. Freaking love this album. I feel very fortunate to have the opportunity to listen to this album, let alone talk about it. And maybe you should listen to it yourself. Don't take my word for it. Listen to it yourself. Have your own experiences. And then tell me which ones are your favorite, because I want to know. What is your favorite Radiohead album? Do you agree with my list? Do you want to fight about my list? My Radiohead list? I don't think you want to mess with me. I got a fierce dog here. This dog will eat you alive. You see this dog? She's not even looking. She's fierce, and she's really bad at paying attention. But yeah, this was a very fun video for me to do. I actually would like to start a series where I do this for many artists. I would preferably like these artists to have, I would like them to have at least 5 albums, maybe more. But if you have any idea of artists that I should do a best to worst for, you know where to find me.